Philip, it's a bit of a chorus growing at a time, of course, when the government keeps saying they haven't got any money to do anything.
Well, it is. It's not the first time a US general has said that the UK hasn't got the ability to be a tier one military force. And the UK is still really the only country that can put an armoured formation alongside a US armoured formation in a war-fighting environment. And they've still just got the ability to do that, but only just. I think the Army's having real difficulty in justifying money being spent on it, as opposed to the Air Force and the Navy, who can clearly demonstrate their prowess from an international and a Britain international perspective, whereas the Army is having difficulty doing that. And the Army aren't managing their own money well.
And is it perhaps part of the so-called peace dividend that we remember at the end of the Cold War when things changed in Russia, and perhaps we had a sort of false sense of security, if you pardon the pun, given what we're seeing now in Ukraine?
Well, it's partially that, but it's also partially the Operation Reality that happened after the Cold War. We then got into the Balkans conflicts. We then got into Iraq. We then got into Afghanistan. And the Army was equipped for fighting the Russians in Europe in a conventional warfare scenario. It hadn't been thinking ahead to how things might change and making sure it was equipping itself. And therefore, it very rapidly re-equipped itself and retrained itself into lighter counterinsurgency, peacekeeping, peace enforcement operations, bringing lots of new money in and that. And whilst it was doing that, it wasn't thinking how the threat was changing and how it might need to go in the future. And that's part of the problem. The Army's not thinking ahead. It's reacting. It's preparing itself for whatever the last conflict was, but it's not looking forward. And I suffered that in Iraq because they didn't learn the lessons from Northern Ireland and elsewhere.
But can one blame them that, now we're talking about tanks, which, of course, is going back again to the Cold War and armoured divisions in Germany to meet the Russian threat. And, clearly the thought was let's have more mobile, smaller forces. We're now back to a very different kind of assessment, it seems.
Well, it is. But, the very people that are at the top of the Army at the moment and the people that are at the top of defence, 18 months ago, before Ukraine happened, were talking about everything being in the grey zone and cyber taking over from everything. And that's why they could justify cutting. The current Chief of the General Staff, whenever he commanded the joint headquarters and joint operations, was turning around and saying just that. Now he's the one saying we need tanks. Come on, he's paid an awful lot of money to think ahead. Not to think tomorrow, but to think 5 years and 10 years ahead. And Tobias Ellwood has been saying that the conventional threat has been growing for the last 5 years. He's the chair of the Defence Select Committee. We shouldn't have the Defence Select Committee telling our generals what to do. The generals should be informing the Defence Select Committee.
Good
we seem
point.
to have got this the wrong way around.
Yeah, and not to look 5 years ahead, but just this next year, how do you see things now unfolding in Ukraine, given we keep getting these warnings about a Russian spring offensive?
Well, the Russian spring offensive, the Russians are on a timeline. They need to carry out their offensive operations before the Ukrainians get Western tanks and Western infantry fighting vehicles deployed in a way that they can use. And it's still a few months off the Ukrainians being able to deploy them because they need to learn how to operate the tanks. They need to learn how to maintain the tanks. They also need to learn how to fight them with the infantry fighting vehicles and elsewhere. But now that Western countries have decided to give their high-end land-based equipment, then that's a political decision to say they're going to support Ukraine with whatever it needs. The next logical step, because you don't fight tanks by themselves in isolation, you need to be able to do that under an umbrella of at least local air superiority. The next logical step is for the Ukrainians to be given better aircraft so that they can impose that local air superiority, and then they'll have a much better chance of being able to punch through the Russians and exploit any advantages that they get. Until then, I think the Ukrainians are fixing the Russians in place. That may mean that they have to give a little bit of ground in order to buy time. That time is being used to train the Ukrainian troops up in this new Western equipment.